Associate Professor Toby Freeman from Stratton Health Equity at the University of Adelaide. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm chairing this meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people joining online today. This webinar is part of a series of webinars as part of the Health Equity Learning Lab Oz, which comes under the research project Restoring the Fair Go, which is Professor Fran, the first speaker's National Health and Medical Research Council funded fellowship. And today's theme is on privilege and equity. So as inequities in income, wealth, education and health persist and increase in many countries globally, some scholars are turning the lens onto privilege to better understand how these inequities are created and maintained. So our two speakers today are Professor Fran Baum and Professor Clive Hamilton, and they'll examine how the inequitable distribution of power, money and resources is supported by public policy and social structures, and how we can begin to address them for a fairer society. I will invite presentations from first Fran and then Clive, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So please, as they talk, if you could pop your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, we'll use those to facilitate the Q&A at the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded and it will be put online on our website after today. And if you're interested, past webinars in the series are also up on our website. So the first presenter is Professor Fran Baum, AO, who is the Director of Stratton Health Equity at the University of Adelaide. She's a public health social scientist with a special interest in creating healthy, equitable and sustainable societies. In 2021, she won the NHMRC Investigator Grant for this project, and much of her work examines the commercial determinants of health, governance, policy, and the power dynamics and structures which cause and sustain inequities. So thank you, Fran, and over to you. And you're on mute.
There, is that all clear now?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks Toby for the introduction. And just to mention, Ashley Schramm, who was going to speak here, is sick, and so she's unable to speak today. So I sort of stepped into the breach to do that. And I'm really going to talk about wealth, privilege and health today. That's interesting. So I'd also like to acknowledge country, and that I'm also on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and pay respects to the elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge their resilience through the processes of colonisation. And also to acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. So I'm going to just talk a bit about the extent of wealth inequity globally in Australia, look at the strange reluctance to study wealth and privilege, look at some emerging research, and then a quick look at policy implications. So I think we've all seen a lot of these kind of graphs looking at wealth, but what this one shows is that from the Global Wealth Report, that the richest 1.5% own nearly half of the world's wealth. So you can see the population share of people who have under $10,000 is huge, and their wealth share is tiny. And at the right-hand side, you can see the small part of population that has a huge amount of wealth share. And of course, the other thing is that that's been growing rapidly in recent years. So now the wealth of just the wealth of 26 billionaire exceeds many national GDPs. You can see there it exceeds Italy, Brazil, Canada, and other countries. And you can also see that we've seen the growth of oligarchies. That's a small group of very powerful people that controls a government or society, and see how much the millionaires club has grown rapidly in the past decade. So there's been this massive concentration of wealth. And in the US particularly, the wealth of the top billionaires in the US has really soared. We all know about Elon Musk, but you can see going down the list, a lot of them to do with tech. But that's just comparing their wealth at a period from March 2020 to December 24. And Oxfam has forecast that if these current trends continue, there'll be 5 trillionaires. And I think it's very hard to imagine what a trillionaire is, but it's absolutely massive within a decade. And we'll still have about over 3.5 billion people who are living below the poverty line of just under $7 a day. So the predictions are that this wealth is going to go on increasing. Now, why do we worry about that? You know, some people will say, oh, that's fine, it'll trickle down, it won't make any difference. But Anthony Atkinson, in this book he wrote about inequality, what could be done, 10 years ago, he said the present level of economic inequalities are intrinsically inconsistent with the conception of a good society. And that book really unpacks why that's the case. And of course, the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett has shown that health and social problems are worse in more unequal countries. So they developed an index of all those things you can see on the left-hand side, including life expectancy, performance in education, infant mortality, homicides, and so on. And then they charted that against low and high income inequality and showed that there seemed to be a close relationship between that. So what they're saying is that the more unequal a country is in the way it distributes its wealth and income, then the more health and social problems they seem to have. And I think it's worth, if you think about the US, you can see how the US is really up here in the right-hand corner with high income inequality and a whole lot of health and social problems. And a recent book called The Fall of Civilizations, which was published just last month, one of the predictive factors that Paul Cooper found after studying a whole range of civilizations is that growing and extreme inequities was one of the predictive factors for the fall of civilizations. So that might suggest where we're headed. So given the extremes of wealth distribution, then it's always intrigued me why public health hasn't studied health and privilege more than poverty and disadvantage. And in fact, I wrote an article in 2005 where I argued that we needed to do more research on wealth and health, and we actually needed an epidemiology of wealth, and that we really needed to understand the dynamics of wealth and its consequences for public health. And since then, with my research team, we've tried to look more and more at those factors that underpin wealth and underpin the privilege that kind of leads to wealth. The recent report from the WHO, which was published in April, the World Report on the Social Determinants of Health Inequities, included this vicious cycle. And it's kind of quite typical of the way we look at social and economic inequities and so health inequities, whereas it does highlight inequality, poverty, discrimination, unemployment. But as you'll see, the main focus is on people in disadvantaged situations. So people research the health impacts of discrimination, of unemployment, of poor housing, food insecurity, and so on. So the focus is really on those people who are living in disadvantaged situations. Whereas in the same report, they also had a virtuous cycle where they said, well, if we did have a society with lower health inequities, then what would it look like? And of course, they look at some of these things like progressive taxation and inequitable wealth distribution. And I think to understand that virtuous cycle, we also need to understand how inequality is maintained and deepened. And I'm quoting Ashley, who can't be with us today, but at a recent workshop in Canberra, she said, unprecedented wealth inequality is neither accidental nor inevitable. It is structurally produced, politically protected, and culturally normalized. And I think that's a really important, it doesn't happen by chance. It's not just by good luck. So there's all sorts of ways in which we've seen in the last 3 decades, I guess, since the period in which neoliberalism has come to dominate public policy, that greed is good, a celebration of extreme wealth, and of course, the rise of billionaires to political power. And I don't think we can understand this without looking at also the rise of the corporation. And I remember in the 1990s reading this book by David Corton, When Corporations Rule the World, where he said that corporations were ruling the world like feudal overlords. And he made the point that they had an obsession with economic growth, which of course fuels those corporations and unhealthy consumption and extraction. And he made the point, particularly in his later book, A Living Economy for a Living Earth, that humans were part of an interconnected web of life, dependent for our well-being upon one another and the living earth. But he really did name the way in which corporations were becoming so dominant and were fueling a lot of the privilege and wealth that was rising to the top. And again, I think there's been lots of talk about the pay of the CEOs of those companies that now make about 400 times as much as a typical worker. Whereas if you look back to 1970, there was very little difference. There was a much more equal situation, whereas now it's become extremely unequal. And as you can see, that is continuing to rise. If you look between, while there was a drop during COVID, after the COVID recovery, that's gone on to recover and become more extreme than ever. So there really is an ideology of privilege, I think, and you'll hear much more about this, I think, how this shows itself from Clive. There's a protection of elite interests by government. There's money, power, and resources are used to protect people's privilege. There's a distraction of the problem, I think, of inequity by placing emphasis on poverty and disadvantage, which leads to victim blaming of people living in disadvantage. And an ideology that people who are privileged have worked hard for their wealth, which I think shown up in this cartoon. Less whinging, more hard work. I'm sick of people asking for handouts. No one ever handed me anything on a plate. So, I think you can see that kind of privilege that's taken for granted and the kind of attitudes that underlie that. So I just here put some of the research that both Sharon Frill's team and Ashley Schramm and Amy Carrad have been doing at ANU, which I've been a little part of, which has been looking at how do you evaluate how public policy drives inequities by looking at privilege, and how do you monitor privilege for health equity, which I think is really important work. The work we've been doing in Stretton Health Equity has been looking at the health and equity impacts of global consultancy firms and showing how they've sort of contributed to this trend and have infiltrated themselves into all sorts of areas of lives, including universities. And also the bottom paper on the bottom right-hand side, looking at outsourcing or privatization, a paper we've just published, and how that's affected health and equity. And of course, the privatization has been part of that build-up of wealth, private wealth and corporations. So some of the work we've been doing through my fellowship has been running a series of world cafes, and you can see so far we've run them in Tasmania, Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales, Northern Territory, SA, and last week in WA, where we asked people the simple question, how do we reduce health inequities in Australia? And we will be running one more in the ACT and the business community. And one of the areas we looked at was indeed income and wealth, and asked people what they thought about that. And the sheets are kind of where we're trying to summarize those ideas at the end. But people who came to the World Cafe were really interested in redistributive tax reform, to consider death duties, a wealth tax, taxing unhealthy products, increasing corporations tax. They were very, very clear that there should be universal provision, union membership. They wanted to explore universal income, increase New Start payment, ask questions such as, when is enough in terms of wealth? Should we have a cap on wealth? Some people have suggested $10 million should be the maximum. That gender equity is crucial to addressing income and wealth. If you think back to the list of super rich people, it's mainly men. We need to de-link housing and wealth, and also reform political donations, because people felt that was underlying it. So there's lots of ideas for what we might do, and we're not short of policy ideas. And of course, civil society protests are growing and demanding fairer taxation. People asking for wealth tax, people asking for the French one in the top right-hand corner, asking for tax on the ultra-rich. So in a conclusion, I think we still need a research agenda on wealth and the privilege that underpins it and how it affects our health. And I think that will involve an epidemiology of wealth. It'll mean looking further into those underpinning structures of privatization, the power of transnational corporations to influence politicians, looking at how wealth is maintained and justified, and understanding the impact of growing wealth inequities on society as a whole. And there, if you think back to that book on that's just been published on why civilizations fall, then it's really important for us to really understand that and really unpacking privilege much further and understanding how it's maintained. So we were so excited to see that Clive had and his partner had written a book on privilege, and I'm really looking forward to hearing much more about that. So thanks. Over to you, Toby.
Thanks so much for that presentation, Fran. That was fantastic. And I will take the opportunity again just to encourage people to think of questions to add into the chat or Q&A function for the end of the webinar. We should have time for plenty of questions. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Clive Hamilton then. Clive Hamilton is an Australian author and public intellectual. Since 2008, he's been a professor of public ethics at Charles Sturt University in Canberra. And for 14 years, until 2008, he was the executive director of the Australia Institute, a progressive think tank that he founded. In 2024, Clive Hamilton and Myra Hamilton published The Privileged Few, which shows that elite privilege is not a mere byproduct of wealth, but an organising principle for society as a whole. The book explores the practices and processes that sustain, legitimise and reproduce elite privilege and show how we are all implicated in the system, both facilitating it and tolerating its harmful effects. So thanks so much, Clive, and over to you.
Thanks, Toby, for that introduction, and to Fran also for that overview of the problem, and to Stretton Health Equity for the invitation and for putting this on. Okay, well, scholars have been researching and writing about social justice and disadvantage for decades, trying to understand how to reduce the gap between rich and poor. And the focus has been very much on the experience of the marginalised and those living in poverty, on the social determinants of disadvantage and how our social and economic institutions entrench rather than support people to overcome hardship. These efforts have concentrated on those at the bottom. Those at the other end of the distribution of wealth and privilege receive very little systematic attention, as if they exist in a kind of different realm. Elite privilege is constructed as a private matter, something they, the elites, enjoy. And as they are not experiencing exclusion, stigmatisation, or alienation, they are not a matter of public concern. Rarely do we consider how our social and economic institutions reproduce and reinforce wealth and privilege, and how the elite's place in the social formation is inseparable from the condition of those at the bottom. Like poverty and disadvantage, elite privilege, we show in the book, is a social issue with social origins creating social harms. So that's what my co-author, Myra Hamilton, Associate Professor at the University of Sydney, and my daughter, that's what we set out to examine in The Privileged Few, which was published last year by Polity Press. The absence of critical attention to elite privilege serves to allow the practices and norms that sustain it to go unchallenged and disguise its social impacts. We argue that by focusing on the top, we can understand the processes that entrench social justice inequality, and disadvantage. Elite privilege is not merely a consequence of wealth or status. It's socially produced, reinforced, and passed on through what can be described as the machinery of privilege. That is, the social practices, norms, and institutional arrangements that confer exclusive advantage on those with wealth and influence, while systematically excluding others. Most of Australia's important institutions, as we show at some length in the book, such as schools, the labour market, the legal system, and many others up to the High Court, are organised in ways that generate advantages for those who already have wealth and influence and deny those advantages to others. So the machinery of privilege creates a set of circumstances in which people with wealth and influence cultivate a separateness from the broader community, have a different relationship with the rules that govern community life, and enjoy advantages that the broader community do not have access to. And we show in the book that these create harms: social, economic, psychic, and civic harms. Let me comment on some of these phenomena, that is, elites' separateness, rule bending, and exclusive advantage, with an excursus on the harms briefly, perhaps at the end. People with privilege cultivate a sense of physical and symbolic distance and distinction from the majority. While this transpires in multiple ways, including through embodied signals, such as the confidence, ease, and comportment in the use of elite bodies, I'll focus on three vehicles for the production of separateness: space, time, and education. The privileged experience space differently from the rest of society. They physically separate themselves by occupying exclusive suburbs, private estates, and luxury spaces like super yachts, private jets, airport lounges, and private suites. These environments are curated to avoid crowds and discomfort, reinforcing a sense of superiority and control of the environment. Elite neighbourhoods, for example, become sacred spaces. They provide access to influential networks and confer symbolic status, where residents are perceived as respectable and trustworthy. Membership by lower income people is made impossible, not only by the cost of housing, but also by various explicit and implicit forms of cultural exclusion. This privileged relationship with space is mirrored in their control over time. Avoiding queues is an obvious manifestation of privilege, one commented on frequently by participants in the series of focus groups that we conducted in preparation for writing our book. One of the participants commented many commented on how queues at airports and sporting venues were examples that they experienced. But one in particular, who had been on the edges of great wealth, spoke very interestingly, I think, about how the very rich not only jump queues, but often move in spheres where there are no queues, worlds that those without privilege are simply not aware of. Waiting, and even more so being made to wait, can provide us with a sense that one is not fully in command of one's life. Anyone who's had the misfortune of spending hours in a hospital emergency ward knows that the medical system is one of the sites par excellence of anxious, powerless waiting. In a seminal study, American psychologist Barry Schwartz came to a blunt conclusion. The distribution of waiting time coincides with the distribution of power. The relative immunity from waiting that the powerful enjoy is guaranteed because they have the resources to refuse to wait. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu takes this a step further, arguing that the state and its bureaucracies impose waiting times as an expression of state power. Citizens are compelled to wait with little control over the outcome, and these temporalities shape the citizen-state relationship. Unlike everyday citizens, elites do not view the state as a mysterious and alien force. They understand the processes of bureaucracy and where the points of discretion lie. They know people and how to use their networks, status, and power to remove blockages. If they're unfamiliar with some part of the system, they know someone who can advise and guide them. Returning to the hospital emergency ward, Phil Gould, the renowned rugby league coach and commentator in Sydney, told of frantically phoning his friend Nick Politis in the middle of the night to tell him that his mother was very ill in hospital. Politis, a billionaire and power player, is owed many favours. And so he contacted one of Australia's leading neurosurgeons, who got out of bed in the middle of the night and went to the hospital in his dressing gown to attend to Phil Gould's mother. Together, these advantages in space and time reinforce a dual reality, one where elites operate freely and efficiently, and another where ordinary citizens are subject to delay, surveillance, and constraint. This separation amplifies privilege by allowing elites to opt out of shared civic experiences, further entrenching inequality and undermining social cohesion. In the machinery of privilege, elite private schools form the engine. British scholars Francis Green and David Kynaston describe elite private schools as powering an enduring cycle of privilege that creates an educational apartheid. Elite schools do this by cultivating their exclusivity and imbuing in their students the sense that they are exceptional and different from other children. When we talk about elite private schools in Australia, we're talking about a small number of expensive schools with annual fees in excess of, say, $30,000 for final year students. Now, schools that cater for perhaps 5% or so of students and are mostly, oddly, perhaps associated with the Protestant churches. It's important to distinguish these elite private schools from the large number of low to middle fee private schools, because when they come under attack, elite private schools attempt to disavow their exclusiveness by hiding amongst all private schools. At the most basic level, elite private schools create separateness by setting their fees to send a signal of exclusivity to the market. Fees at Scotch College in Melbourne, for example, are $46,000 per child per annum for years 9 to 12. Although they pretend otherwise, enrolment at an elite school is only possible for a few, and this conveys something special about them. Daily life surrounded by opulent facilities, such as well-being centres, Olympic-grade sporting facilities, acres of well-mown sporting fields, and recently in Sydney, a student centre in a replica Scottish castle. All of these are designed to add to the sense of being among the elite. It's not only the sumptuous physical environment that creates a sense of distinction. By socialising their students into the culture and practices of elites, these schools aim at imbuing students with certain moral qualities. As one graduate observed when they joined an elite private school, on my first day, we were given a talk by the headmaster. He told us, "You are the creme de la creme of this country. Sitting around you are future leaders, Don't you forget it. This process of elevation is referred to in some parts of the literature as consecration, the sanctification of students as beyond the ordinary. The process of consecration occurs through the continued recreation of an aura using the culture, history, traditions, ceremonies, and rituals of the school. The schools become, in the words of Professor Jane Kenway, who's done brilliant work in this field, in her words and that of her colleagues, spaces of elective affinity, imbuing students with the sense of wonder and specialness of the school worlds that they are initiated into. At the same time, students are encouraged to move only in these spaces of affinity and to eschew opportunities to mix with others. For example, in many elite schools, students are forbidden from playing community sport in favour of playing only in elite school sport competitions. American sociologist Susan Ostrander captured this in her study, reporting a mother of children at an elite school saying, "You don't go to private school just for your education. You go there to be separated from ordinary people." Ostrander concluded that attending expensive schools is a way for the elite to create and maintain the exclusivity of their way of life. Australia's elite schools, therefore, are the foremost unifying institution of the ruling elite, instilling in students a separateness from and elevation above the broader community, exacerbating the distances between the rich and the rest. Looked at another way, using Bourdieu, elite schools are sites for converting economic capital, the fees paid by parents, into social capital, that is, the personal connections and influence networks acquired at school, and into cultural capital, that is, the dispositions, knowledge, and behaviours required to reproduce and enhance privilege, status, and wealth. Let me now comment on the different relationship with the rules that elite privilege enables. Privilege is not merely something people have, it's something people do. Social interactions are governed by unwritten rules of the game, which elites learn early through family and elite schooling. They develop, to use a football analogy, a feel for the game, allowing them to navigate institutions and bend rules to their advantage. Jane Kenway identifies this in what she describes as the first rule of entitlement fostered at elite private schools. You are entitled to have a privileged relationship with the rules and the law. Our focus group participants echoed this perception. One noted, quote, "The top 1% operate in a pretty different world. There are different rules for those sort of people." In our national survey for the book, only 37% of Australians agreed that overall the rules are applied fairly. 51% agreed with the statement, "In Australia, there's one rule for the rich and another for the rest." Elite privilege, therefore, comes with the ability to bend, sidestep, or ignore rules that constrain others. Sociologist Michael Holmquist, in his study of an elite suburb near Stockholm, found that wealthy residents viewed regulations as obstacles to be overcome, often bypassing formal channels and going straight to decision makers. There were instructive demonstrations of how all of this works during the COVID pandemic lockdowns. We did a bunch of FOI requests shortly afterwards. And one of them revealed how the Western Australian billionaire Kerry Stokes was able to manipulate public lockdown rules and quarantine requirements, which were especially strict in Western Australia, to gain exemptions to avoid hotel quarantine and instead isolate at his luxury home. The FOI document showed that his request to bypass the rules or be exempted activated the attention and time of the following people. This is during a national crisis, bear in mind. The Premier, his Chief of Staff, the Chief Health Officer, the Director General of the Health Department, the Police Commissioner and State Emergency Commissioner, and the Federal Finance Minister, along with numerous high-level officials. All of them dropped other things to devote time to the request by Kerry Stokes to get an exemption from the rules. And his request to be exempted demonstrates how elites can bypass normal channels through their influence and connections. In the system of elite privilege, the rules are negotiable for the powerful. Documents obtained through another FOI request revealed that elite private schools in Sydney during the lockdowns received special treatment, while public school students, especially in disadvantaged areas, were confined to remote learning at home, where home was often a difficult environment. Students from elite schools like Redlands in Sydney were permitted to travel to their second campuses for snow sports and outdoor education. And these exemptions were secured through sophisticated lobbying, reports by the school's own risk and compliance officer, and direct engagement with health officials, including the attention of the Chief Health Officer, who was at the time in the thick of the most serious public health crisis for 100 years. All so one elite school could find a way through the rules in ways that a public school principal could not even imagine. These examples illustrate how privilege enables a kind of hyper-agency, the power to reshape one's environment and evade constraints. To live by a different set of rules, wrote the American sociologist Paul Shervish, quote, is the fundamental endowment of wealth. Such actions reinforce the belief that elites are above the rules that apply to the majority. Let me just finish with a couple of minutes on the harms. We talk in the book about the psychic, civic and social and economic harms inflicted by the privilege machine. Psychic harms refer to the everyday emotional and psychological injuries experienced by those lower down the social order, often manifesting as in the everyday slights, humiliations and exclusions. Privilege shapes a psychic landscape in which those lower down the social hierarchy experience shame and often feelings of inferiority, the other side of the sense of specialness, superiority and entitlement felt by the privileged. Our focus groups and survey data revealed widespread discomfort and at times distress linked to these distinctions in everyday life. People in the focus groups, those who attended state schools, reported instances where others, like their boss or their supervisor, cringed or recoiled when they mentioned the school that they went to. In our national survey, half of people surveyed said that they had been made to feel ashamed of the school they went to or the suburb they grew up in or lived in. And many admitted that they actually concealed their school or their suburb in order to avoid judgment or being excluded. Half of our survey participants reported feeling angry or resentful when they saw wealthy people having rules applied differently. Richard Sennett and John Cobb described the feelings of disappointment, shame, and eventually resignation as some of the hidden injuries of class. When people think that public institutions are not applying the rules fairly or equally, people lose faith in those institutions and the rules. We call these civic harms. When authorities bend the rules or allow elites to ignore them, public trust in democracy and regulatory institutions is undermined. People become cynical. Social cohesion is damaged. Social and economic harms arise when elites impose costs on others in the exercise of their privilege, such as using their influence to offer or obtain opportunities denied to others without privilege, or internships, for example, or when elites lobby for policies that disproportionately benefit those with wealth and deprive those lower down the social hierarchy of income and opportunities. The systematic conferral of advantage often co-opts the idea of merit in order to conceal the ways that systematic advantage strengthens and reproduces elite power. Co-option of merit frames elite advantage as a natural outcome of natural talent or effort. One of the costs is that those who miss out on chances in life see their lack of success as the result of their own shortcomings, rather than the outcome of a system that favours the privileged. So, and I'll finish on this point, those who succeed, on the other hand, in an apparently meritocratic system, often believe that they are entirely deserving of their success, suppressing the life advantages and social structures that reward privilege. As a result, they view those who have not succeeded as undeserving. So let me finish there and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much for such a fantastic presentation, Clive. That was really, really thought-provoking. I particularly appreciated the emphasis on the question about which school you're from, which apparently is something we in Adelaide are very famous for asking all the time. So it's very, very relevant. Thank you all so much for the excellent questions coming in through the chat. I will just take them in the order that they came through in. So the first one, Fran, was during your presentation, which I think is about the World Cafes. Was there any discussion of lowering tax on healthy food as well? Currently, cheap food, even if unhealthy, may help some families access enough calories, and just making it more expensive while not providing an alternative healthy option may not complete the picture.
Yeah, I think some people raise the idea of subsidising healthy food. And of course, we've had lots of discussion about remote Aboriginal communities, which is an ongoing problem of how you can get healthy food to those areas. But certainly the whole area of unhealthy ultra-processed food and the way in which it's being manufactured and I mean, it's not just that it's high fat and sugar, but it has all sorts of other additives in it, and how that really is unhealthy.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is for both of you, whoever would like to respond. Given the understanding that humans need each other and the earth for survival, what is working to shift the narrative from neoliberalism and hyper-individualism to community connectedness, collective social responsibility?
Clive, do you want to go first?
No, I think you should, Fran.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's such a big question. I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, how you get to a society that's more connected and more collectively responsible. So if we think about Australia, and you think about Australia in the 1950s, coming out of a war, there probably was a much greater sense of collectivity. And, people always say, oh, how can we get higher taxes? But I think under Menzies, the highest tax rate was about 70%. And I guess the justification for that was that we were rebuilding from a war, and so we should do that. So I think there are times in history when that happens. And I guess for me, it's having a whole network, and certainly this has come out in our World Cafes, of community structures. Now, that might be community libraries, community health centres, but places that actually bring people together and build solidarity. And of course, what we did have was much higher levels of union membership in the past, which of course did challenge elite privilege, I think. And, you know, we had well over half the population would have been in a union. And for instance, in Finland, that still is the case, a country which does have a much more egalitarian bent. So I think it's about having those structures in society that are collective, that are sort of open to people, that are based on the notion of community rather than based on the notion of individuals. And I guess it's also at the same time not just focusing on that, but undoing some of the privileges that Clive Hamilton's talked about. I mean, certainly a loud voice in our World Cafe, Clive, was we have to stop subsidizing elite sports centres for private schools. And there were lots of times that people would say, well, you know, all the sorts of things you've talked about. That was a very common view that was coming through, that why are we subsidizing these schools? If they want to have them, they should be paying the full cost of them. So that was a really strong one. So I guess it's one thing is undoing those kind of places of privilege, but also building up the places of community which support people in their communities to have a decent life, you know, and there's all sorts of ways in which that happens.
Well, thanks, Fran. I think building on that, and particularly given Clive's references to the survey and focus group findings, why do we have, Matt Fisher asks, why do politicians who are relatively wealthy are typically not among the super rich work so hard to protect or accede to the interests of the super rich? And add to that, you know, why do we still have the policies of so much public funding to private schools and such obviously inequitable policies like that people complain about? Why are they still in place?
Well, I think part of the reason we don't see extremely wealthy people going into politics in Australia, and it differs from country to country. Probably the richest person we've had for quite some time has been Malcolm Turnbull, is because they look at what politics is and the disdain with which politicians are nowadays regarded and think, why would I want to subject myself to that? I can exercise my power and influence in other ways. And that's a deterrent. On the private school public subsidy question, this does generate white-hot anger in the community. And it is extraordinary that our political leaders, particularly in the Labor Party, tolerate this. They know it's wrong, I think most of them, but they're too afraid to do anything about it because of the solidarity that the private schools are able to exercise. And when I say that, I mean private schools as a whole, those that charge low-fee Catholic school $4,000 a year to ones that now charge over $50,000. And as I mentioned in my talk, the elite ones conceal themselves in this general ruck. And they have all kinds of bizarre reasons about why, if you took our money away, you know, bad things would happen. And besides, lots of, you know, every day average Aussies come to our schools, which is a total lie, and yet they get away with it. What is more astonishing is that the poorer schools allow this to happen. Why do the poor and middle income schools give cover to the expensive elite schools? To me, this is the great mystery. I'll just make one further comment on this, that we focus very much on grants to private schools, particularly elite private schools, but not much attention is paid to, for some schools, a bigger source of public funding, and that is the tax deductibility of donations to the building funds of elite private schools. Maya and I have just made a brief 2-page submission to this inquiry that the Labor government, or summit the Labor government, is having on economic prosperity and productivity on exactly this point. It's bizarre in so many ways. I mean, an extremely rich person living in, you know, Double Bay can give and does give $5 million to Cranbrook, and they get close to $2.5 million back, paid for by the everyday taxpayer, including those who send their kids to struggling public schools out in the western suburbs. I mean, it's just so utterly unfair and unequal. And I think every time there's a news story about Cranbrook or one of the other extremely rich schools getting money, private donations, building a new Olympic-sized swimming pool and a concert hall, this does a real moral injury to millions of Australians. They just feel this is so deeply unfair and kind of scar on society. And yet the Labor Party in particular, because you would expect them to respond to this in the interest of social equity, do nothing about it, or very little. And so they therefore are basically funding the continued exercise and entrenchment of privilege in Australia.
Thank you. Thank you. Fran, did you want to add to that at all? You're on.
Yeah, I know. I was just getting
Right.
it off. No, I mean, it just shows how we've developed a system that accepts that privilege rather than challenging it. And, you know, the idea that the taxation system is that unfair is astounding. But I mean, there's lots of ways in which there are taxes minimized and people are able to do that, and that's just one of them. So I guess it's the overall picture of the big loopholes in tax, and probably the richer people are, the more able they are to avoid paying their fair share of tax.
Thank you. Thanks. Nathan Manning asks, does the crumbling of the neoliberal order present opportunities for undermining elite privilege and stark inequalities? So do either of you see any particular opportunities presenting themselves in the current moment in time to start addressing these better?
Well, I'm not. Are you sure, Nathan, that the neoliberal order is crumbling? Number one, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, you know, hopefully we'll look back and see that it was, but I'm not really sure whether or not it is. And of course, you know, at the moment in the US, we're seeing the opposite. I mean, we're actually seeing a government that is really underlining and enhancing elite privilege in an amazing way, you know, cutting benefits from Medicare and other kind of benefits, and reducing tax rates for the rich. So it's hard to know really what it's such a. I mean, it's such an undermining of the world order, of the US dominance. And it'll be interesting to see as China moves further on the stage. I mean, one thing China has done in the last 10 years is reduce absolute poverty in its country, and it's done that very effectively. So, you know, but within a kind of a capitalist, within a capitalist orientation, but recognizing that inequities was a threat to its regime. So just set out and said, we have to do something about this, and used a kind of whole of government approach to do that.
Yeah, just on that, I think in China's case, it wasn't motivated by an attempt to resolve inequality, but really it was a poverty-oriented program. But even that, it was a kind of side effect of rapid export-oriented industrialization, which soaked up vast numbers of people. At the same time, the inequality in China has increased enormously. But I think the question might have been about the crumbling of the liberal rules-based order rather than neoliberalism as such, which is definitely taking place. And we've shifted from the so-called unipolar moment, which emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, into a bipolar and possibly multipolar world. I'm not sure that that's going to provide opportunities because it may in fact lead to a world that's more chaotic, more unstable, and ones in which progressive governments, so far as we ever do have progressive governments, are willing to take those kinds of measures. And I might add, at a time over the next decades when the pressures arising from global warming and the catastrophes being visited on us increasingly by climate change are going to put governments and peoples under massive pressure. And already we're seeing substantial efforts by the super rich to protect themselves, to isolate themselves, so that when the social chaos and pressures come, they will be able to embed themselves in environments where they'll be able to control what happens to them and let the rest go to hell. I don't think they'll succeed in that, because they just won't be able to escape. They're still going to need people to build for them, wait on them, grow food for them. But even so, I think over the next decades, the pressures of global warming are going to change everything in ways that we can only partially see at the moment.
Thank you, Clive. I apologise that we won't have time for all of the questions, but I might ask Carrie Lumby's, which is, there is so much focus on the corporate sector. Keen on Clive or Fran's thoughts about the contemporary not-for-profit sector and the extent to which, despite its claims to redressing inequities, is in fact an intrinsic part of the machinery of privilege, hoarding power, authority and resources from the people and communities they claim to serve, while also gaining cultural capital for their charitable works?
Yeah, great question. In our book, Maya and I devote quite a bit of attention to the philanthropic sector and the way in which the wealthy and privileged have co-opted philanthropy as a way of increasing or converting their economic capital into greater social and cultural capital. And it's kind of fun to look at, in a kind of bizarre way, to look at the way in which some of the more toxic super rich have become major patrons of our most esteemed and respected cultural institutions, and the way in which they even bring their children, the next generation, into these institutions and put them on the board and get them to mix with all of the right people. In other words, the big cultural institutions that depend on philanthropy have allowed themselves essentially become zones in which the very wealthy can enhance their privilege.
Thank you. Fran, did you want to add to that?
I just think that kind of thing is really the thing that I always find very difficult, those CEO sleepouts, where they pretend to be homeless for a night. And it's, I think that leaves a bad taste in the mouth, really. And it's that idea of sort of claiming all this cultural capital for doing that, whereas in fact, they're not really experiencing what it's like to be homeless for the night. But I also do worry about how much many of the not-for-profit sector is taking on a sort of corporatized shell. They've moved away, and it's good they've moved away from the sort of charity model. But I think there needs to be a model that's somewhere, that is about empowering and helping people, and not about sort of a corporatization of that kind of assistance. So I think Carrie's getting at something there.
Indeed, and a lot of the big NGOs, charities, even environment groups have kind of fallen for the kind of neoliberal message that we need to adopt corporate style marketing and communications. And in order to do that, we need to get some really successful business people onto our board. And the way they think, we also talk about this in the book, the way the NGOs start to think about the world and their place in it tends to become more conservative, they're more risk averse. They have to operate within the confines of the system to be more respectable, rather than be out there challenging the system and you know, being a pain in the ass, which is, you know, in my view, certainly for environment groups, what they should be doing. And there is this fantastic irony where you have the Protestant churches that are setting up, you know, soup kitchens to help the poor on, you know, in the morning, and then cultivating these elite private schools in the afternoon, where their afternoon work makes everything they do in the morning pointless. And in fact, their afternoon work makes their morning work necessary, because the kind of privilege thinking that then infects the whole system, including our political system, cannot see poverty and disadvantage as a product of the system, but rather the arising from the faults of the disadvantaged.
That's an excellent place to end. Thank you both so much for such a fantastic conversation. Again, this has been recorded and will be put up on our website if you want to refer other people to it, if you found it interesting. But thank you both so much again.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.